What's up, guys? Welcome back to part 3 of the history of plants as we know it. We finally get to the beginning of the earth changing forever, which is the beginning of land plants. But of course, as we know it from the past 2 episodes, plants didn't start on land for the most of Earth's history up until now, well through what scientists call the boring billion. Most of Earth's history was confined to the water. But around 500 million years ago or so, a shift was beginning to happen from sea plants, specifically streptophytes and chlorophytes, and they began to become more complex. And through that complexity, they were able to evolve certain apomorphies to be able to become onto land. But if we think back to what Earth would have been about this time during the Ordovician and the Silurian periods, about 470, almost 500 million years ago, Earth's land surfaces would have been very barren, very rocky, very shallow soils. The only kind of green that you would have been able to see are the microbial and algae mats that we were talking about in the last episode. So, like I was saying before, the oceans at this time, however, the deep oceans, deeper oceans, as deep as readily light will penetrate, you had the streptophytes and the chlorophytes diversifying pretty well. And they used some of this more basic cellular machinery to be able to colonize land. But to live on land, that requires a whole new toolkit that was eventually evolved by these algae. So, leaving the water came with enormous risks. The ocean plants never had to worry about drying out. They never had to worry about really filtering ultraviolet light because the ocean did that for them by breaking it up. They never had to transport water internally. They were pretty much had it on easy mode. But on land, these problems were exacerbated and they became life or death challenges for the early ancestors of what we have today. So, I mean, imagine an early algal bloom without protection. It would shrivel very quickly. So why would plants even risk it at all? Why come to land? Why come to such a harsh environment? Well, it was largely a nutrient and sunlight thing. More sunlight, more nutrients, not as much competition. So because of those things, there was an incentive to get on land even though it was so challenging. But eventually, the learning curve was fulfilled by embryophytes. Their name comes from embryo, obviously, because as their namesake shows, they protect their embryo rather than having free-floating gametes. They actually protect their gametes with like seed-like structures. So that's where the embryophyta or the land plants comes from. The name for it because they protect their embryo within a coating. Some other innovations by embryophyta that enabled them to be on land was cuticle, which was a waxy coating on leaf structures, or early leaf structures, and which weren't really leaf structures, they were stem structures, but it was a waxy coating to reduce water loss. They evolved stomata, which are tiny adjustable pores that balance gas exchange. They also evolved things like sporopollen, a tough biopolymer coating spores and making them resistant to drying and UV damage, as well as something that was a very important thing to evolve at the time, which was mycorrhizal symbiosis. And to understand mycorrhizal symbiosis, first we have to understand what regular symbiosis is, which you probably learned in grade school biology, but just in case you haven't, symbiosis is just when two organisms mutually benefit each other in a relationship. And for this relationship, the mycorrhizal symbiosis, this was early partnerships with fungi that helped plants extract nutrients from nutrient-poor soils, which, in terms of nutrient poorness, it wasn't so much that the nutrients were poor in the soils, it was more so that they were unbalanced, or at least not correctly balanced for early land plants. This was remedied by early mechanisms in symbiosis of mycorrhiza. So plant root hairs would produce sugars, and then these fungi and bacteria would come in and colonize those sugars and eat those sugars and produce bioavailable nitrogen, bioavailable phosphorus, and bioavailable potassium for these plants and for their early succession. So who were the first land plants? Well, fossil spores dating back 470 million years ago gave us a window into these pioneers. I talked about it in the last episode, well, touched on it anyways. The earliest confirmed land plants were non-vascular, simple formed like liverworts, and most liverworts, hornworts, and mosses. but we'll stick for liverworts right now. They lacked root stems and leaves as we think of them, but they were already spreading across damp soils, anchoring with rhizoids and creating the first green carpets of Earth's surface. So this is where you would look at it and call it a moss, but it's not a moss. It is something different. It's its own thing. Anyways, over time, these early embryophytes altered the planet itself by breaking down rock, specifically the phosphorus heavy rocks, and trapping sediments and forming soil. So they would encroach onto the land, break down a little bit of material, die themselves, become material for more plants to colonize that would break it down, die, break it down, die, break it down, die, and create these layers by pulling CO2 from the atmosphere and nutrients from the earth. It reshaped Earth's climate and Earth's topography. This process was called terrestrialization. And the reason terrestrialization was so important was because this was one of the bigger turning points for Earth's geographical history. We went from being a barren desert land on land to now the life from the sea is moving to the land. The life that was born in the sea is now moving onto land. Because of this, before this had happened, the great oxidization created our ozone and allowed for this to happen. And then life moving from the sea onto land through liverworts has become one of the single greatest apomorphies that plants were able to actually evolve. And the primary apomorphies that they had was the ability to be turgid outside of water. That was one of the bigger things that they had to overcome, because if you think about it, and you think, like we had mentioned in previous episodes, if you think about whales in water and how light they are due to buoyancy and density, it was the same with plants. And when the tides would pull out these plants without vascular systems or without any kind of turgidity to them, they would just completely flop and lose their mechanical structures. This wasn't true for early liverworts. Liverworts don't have a true vascular system. This is true, but they do have anchoring rhizoids, like I had mentioned before, and they're able to absorb water through their leaf structures, you could call them. They absorb it passively through absorption. So this was a really defining apomorphy to these early mats that were rising straight up out of the water. Modern liverworts are still very close to water on the riverbanks and on the banks of creeks and things like that. I'll throw some examples up. But anyways, these episodes are probably going to be becoming a little bit shorter now that we're digging into the individual genuses and species that are evolving in those genuses. In the next episode, we're going to dig into lycophytes a lot more and talk about their complexities, their distribution, their morphological characteristics, as well as some other things that are relevant to lycophytes. And like I said, we will be digging into the individual genuses and species from here on out. I just wanted to give a brief overview of the history of plants as we know it and how they made it to land in the first place before we start talking about all of their different progenies. Thanks so much for watching, and I appreciate all of the support. If you like the series and you like the content that I'm trying to continue to do, please like and follow and share with anybody who might be like-minded and want to just chill and listen to some nerd talk about plants. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.